What happened in that apartment would later be treated as more than a domestic mistake. On the 17th of April, 1982, in West Los Angeles, Karen Miller, 19, arrived for a Saturday night babysitting job. She used the same front gate, the same elevator, and the same key the parents left under a flower pot. The first odd detail was already in the living room. The VCR was on, with a blank VHS cassette sitting half inserted. Karen did not touch it right away. At 6:40 p.m., she put the kids' dinner in the microwave, checked the thermostat, and scanned the counter for instructions. David Hanley, 38, had left a short list beside the phone. Bedtime at 8:30, no cartoons after dinner, call the neighbor if the hallway buzzer rang. The note did not mention the VCR, and the TV screen was black. At 7:05 p.m., a man Karen did not recognize buzzed the unit. She looked through the peephole and saw a clean haircut, a light jacket, and a small grocery bag held low against his leg. That could have been normal in the building. What was not normal was that he did not speak into the intercom. He buzzed once, waited, and buzzed again, as if he expected the timing to do the work. Karen followed the parent's note and did not open the door. She let the buzzer go quiet and returned to the kitchen. 10 minutes later, she heard the elevator stop again, then footsteps pause outside the unit. The person did not knock. He stood there long enough that she could hear a faint shuffle. Then the footsteps moved away. At 7:30 p.m., Karen checked on the kids, then walked back past the TV. The VCR display now showed a timer symbol she had not set. She leaned down, pressed stop, and the symbol disappeared. The cassette was still in the slot, but it looked like it had been pushed in farther than before. She tried to make sense of it without turning it into a problem. The parents had a new camcorder, and Karen had seen families use the VCR to copy home videos. If a tape was left in by mistake, stopping it would be harmless. She wrote one line on the babysitting notepad. VCR was on when I got here. I hit stop. At 8:10 p.m., the hallway buzzer sounded again. This time, the intercom clicked on by itself, and Karen heard a man's voice say, "Delivery." It was calm, almost rehearsed. Karen did not respond. She watched the peephole again and saw the same light jacket, the same grocery bag, and a second man standing half a step behind him, face turned away from the door. Karen stayed still until the elevator took them away. Then she did something small that she could justify as normal. She pulled the VHS cassette out of the VCR and looked at the label. It was blank, except for a thin strip of masking tape with 3 letters written in pen, LAX. She did not know what it meant, but she did not put the tape back. At 8:25 p.m., she slid the cassette into its cardboard sleeve and placed it in her tote bag under a folded sweatshirt. That was the point where her role shifted from babysitter to accidental custodian. She did not call anyone. She did not confront anyone. She just kept the object. When David Hanley returned around 11:15 p.m., Karen told him about the buzzer and the 2 men. She also told him, plainly, that the VCR had been on and that she had removed a tape labeled LAX. David looked at the tape, did not play it, and asked her to write down the times while he could still remember what she said. He tore a sheet from the notepad, wrote 4/17 at the top, and put both the sheet and the cassette into a kitchen drawer with a rubber band around them. By the end of that night, nothing had been proven, but 3 things were now concrete. The same 2 men had tried the unit twice. The VCR timer had been active without Karen setting it, and a labeled VHS cassette had been moved from the machine into a drawer, with a dated note beside it. The situation had not become a case yet, but the routine had been interrupted in a way that could be checked later. The next contact did not happen that night. It happened 3 days later, on Tuesday morning. At 9:20 m. On April 20, Karen Miller was back at the same apartment for an afternoon shift. The parents had called her again because their regular sitter was out of town. When she unlocked the door, the first thing she checked was the TV cabinet. The VCR was off. The slot was empty. The masking tape label was gone. That absence mattered because the parents had not mentioned moving anything. Karen did not ask. She put her tote bag by the couch and followed the routine again. Lunch dishes, homework at the table, quiet television at low volume. She did not write anything down yet. At 3:40 p.m., the hallway buzzer sounded. It rang once. Then, after a pause that felt measured, it rang again. Karen checked the peephole. This time it was a different man, older, thinner, no bag. He stood too close to the door, close enough that she could not see his hands. He did not speak into the intercom. He waited. After about 15 seconds, he stepped back and left. Karen noted the time on the babysitting pad, the same one from Saturday, and circled it once. That was the first repetition that broke the explanation she had been using. Later that afternoon, while the kids were in their room, Karen opened the kitchen drawer where David Hanley had put the cassette. The drawer was empty, except for utensils. The rubber band was gone. The dated note was gone. She checked the trash under the sink and the hall closet. Nothing. At 5:07 p.m., Karen called the parents at work, something she had not done before. She told David that the tape and the note were no longer in the drawer. He paused long enough that she could hear office noise on the line, then said he would look when he got home. He did not ask her to search further. He told her to keep the doors locked and follow the instructions as written. That evening, at 7:15 p.m., the buzzer sounded again. This time, the intercom activated immediately. A man said, "Maintenance." The word choice was new. The voice was not. Karen recognized the same flat delivery from Saturday night. She did not respond. The voice repeated the word once more, then stopped. When the parents returned at 9:40 p.m., Karen reported all 3 contacts in order, with times written down. David listened, and then did something procedural instead of speculative. He took out a fresh sheet of paper, wrote 4/20 at the top, and asked Karen to read from her notes while he copied them cleanly. He put the sheet into a manila folder and placed it on top of the refrigerator, not back in the drawer. On Thursday, April 22, Karen babysat again. This time the shift was in the morning. At 10:05 a.m., while the kids were watching cartoons, she heard the elevator stop and start twice in quick succession. No buzzer followed. Instead, there was a light knock on the door, not loud enough to be heard from the bedroom. Karen did not answer. Through the peephole, she saw the grocery bag again. The man holding it adjusted his grip, waited, then placed the bag on the floor directly in front of the door. He left without knocking a second time. Karen waited until the elevator doors closed before opening the door. The bag was ordinary. Paper, no markings. Inside were oranges and a folded brown envelope with no address. She did not open the envelope. She did not bring the bag inside. She left it in the hallway, closed the door, and wrote down the time. At Tio, Fertio, A.M. The building's janitor came down the hall pushing a trash cart. Karen flagged him through the chain lock and asked if he knew who had left the bag. He said no and lifted it into the cart without comment. Karen watched him roll it to the service elevator. That was the first time the object left her control without being kept. By Friday, April 23, the pattern was no longer just about visitors. It was about timing. Every contact happened between 7 and 8. 0 inches the evening, or just after 10. 0 inches the morning. The men changed. The language changed. The routine did not. Karen did not confront the parents. She did not warn neighbors. She did one small, defensible thing. She kept copies of her notes at home, folded into a paperback book. She added times, descriptions, and one detail that repeated across all visits. No one ever used the intercom to ask a question. They used it to announce a role. On Saturday, April 24, there was no buzzer, no knock. At 8 p.m., Karen noticed the VCR power light flick on by itself. The tape slot was empty. The machine ran for 12 minutes, then shut off. She wrote it down, including the duration, and did not touch the buttons. By the end of that week, the situation still had no explanation attached to it. But the pattern was now measurable. Contacts occurred on specific days, at specific times. with minor variations in cover stories. Objects appeared and disappeared without explanation, and a machine inside the apartment activated on a schedule no one admitted setting. Nothing had been validated yet. No authority had been contacted, but the repetition had crossed the point where it could be ignored as coincidence. The routine had become consistent enough that the next step, whatever it was, would be predictable. The first verification did not come from listening. It came from replay. On Monday, the 26th of April 1982, David Hanley stayed home from work for the morning. He told Karen he wanted to see what she had been describing while it was still happening. He did not invite anyone else. He did not notify the building office. He treated it as a domestic issue that could still be explained. At 9:55 a.m., they were both in the apartment. The children were at school. The VCR was off. There was no cassette in the slot. David placed a fresh VHS tape on the coffee table, still sealed. He did not insert it. At 10:02 a.m., the VCR power light came on by itself. The tape slot opened and closed once, empty. The machine began recording nothing. The television screen stayed black. David checked the timer display and wrote down the indicator code shown on the front panel. He did not cancel it. At 10:14 a.m., the hallway buzzer rang once. No intercom voice followed. David looked through the peephole this time. The man outside was the same one Karen had seen on Saturday night. Light jacket, grocery bag. He stood directly in front of the door, not angled toward the camera or the intercom panel. After 20 seconds, he left. David wrote down the time and the sequence on a legal pad. He underlined one line twice. At 10:16 a.m., the VCR shut itself off. That afternoon, David did something more deliberate. He opened the VCR cabinet and checked the rear panel. A thin cable ran from the machine through a drilled hole into the wall behind it. The hole was small, clean, and finished with a plastic grommet. It did not match the original construction. David took a Polaroid photo of the cable and the wall, wrote the date on the bottom margin, and placed it in the manila folder with Karen's notes. At 3:30 p.m., he called the building superintendent. He asked if any recent cable work had been authorized for his unit. The superintendent said no and asked David to submit a maintenance request in writing. David did not do it yet. He noted the response instead. On Tuesday, April 27, Karen babysat again. At 7:08 p.m., the buzzer sounded twice in the same pattern as before. This time, David was not home. Karen did not move from the couch. The intercom activated and a man said, "Delivery." The word matched the first night. At 7:10 p.m., the VCR turned on again. There was still no cassette inside. Karen watched the timer count upward on the display for exactly 9 minutes. When it shut off, she wrote down the number and circled it. At 7:25 p.m., the elevator stopped on the floor, but no one approached the door. Karen heard footsteps pause and then move away. She did not check the peephole. On Thursday morning, April 29, David tested something small. He unplugged the VCR before leaving for work. He did not tell Karen. At 10:05 a.m., she was in the apartment with the kids when the hallway buzzer rang once and then went silent. No intercom voice followed. The VCR remained dark. Karen wrote down the time and added one note: no VCR activity when unplugged. That afternoon, David reconnected the machine. He did not insert a tape. By Friday, April 30, the pattern had reached a point where it could be tested against itself. When the VCR was powered and connected, the contacts occurred. When it was disconnected, they did not. The timing still matched the same two windows. The language at the intercom still rotated through the same roles. The first concrete object that could be examined was no longer the missing tape. It was the cable running into the wall. David removed the wall plate around the cable opening. Behind it was a splitter and a second line spliced into the building's internal wiring. The splice was not hidden, but it was neat. He did not touch it further. He photographed it, wrote 4/30 on the photo, and placed it in the folder. At that point, there was enough to move beyond observation. There was a physical modification to the apartment, documented by date. There was a device activating on a schedule that matched external contacts, and there was a clear dependency between the two. On the afternoon of May 1, David made a restrained decision. He called the local cable company, not the police. He reported unauthorized equipment attached to his line and asked for a service inspection. The operator logged the request and gave him a ticket number. David wrote the number at the top of a new page and placed it in the folder with the rest of the materials. Nothing had been accused. No explanation had been accepted. But the situation had crossed from pattern into verification. The behavior could now be reproduced, interrupted, and documented. That was enough to involve someone outside the apartment without yet naming it as anything else. The escalation began with a service appointment, not a raid. On Monday, the 3rd of May 1982, at 8:45 a.m., a cable technician arrived at the apartment building with a marked van and a clipboard. His name was Luis Ortega, 41, and he worked for the regional cable provider. David Hanley met him in the lobby and walked him upstairs. David did not explain the pattern. He pointed out the unauthorized splice and showed the ticket number. At 9:05 a.m., Ortega removed the wall plate and examined the splitter. He confirmed that the added line was not installed by the company. He photographed the connection, filled out a service report, and tagged the line with a temporary label. He did not remove it yet. He said he needed authorization from a supervisor because the line ran beyond the apartment and into shared infrastructure. At 9:22 a.m., while Ortega was still there, the hallway buzzer rang once. David and Ortega both heard it. No intercom voice followed. Ortega noted the time on his report without comment. At 9:24 a.m., the VCR power light came on. There was no cassette inside. Ortega noticed it because he was standing near the cabinet. He asked if the machine was supposed to be on. David said no. Ortega wrote, "Equipment activation observed" on the report and underlined it once. At 9:33 a.m., the VCR shut itself off. That was the first time a third party, acting in a professional capacity, observed the same sequence. Ortega did not speculate. He completed the service report, assigned it a reference number, and said he would escalate it to engineering. On Tuesday, May 4, David received a call from the cable company. The engineering department requested access to the building's main distribution room. The building superintendent approved it in writing. A copy of the approval notice was slid under David's door that afternoon. At 10 a.m., on May 5, Ortega returned with a second technician. They accessed the distribution room in the basement. The unauthorized line from David's unit ran through a ceiling conduit and terminated at a small amplifier mounted behind a locked panel. The amplifier fed into a second coaxial line that ran upward, not outward. The technicians documented the setup, labeled the amplifier, and disconnected it. They sealed the panel with a numbered tag and logged the action in a work order. Ortega left a carbon copy of the work order with David. It listed the date, the equipment type, and the removal time, 10:42 a.m. That afternoon, the routine broke. At 7:05 p.m., Karen was babysitting again. The VCR did not turn on. The hallway buzzer rang once at 7:12 p.m., then went silent. No intercom voice followed. Karen wrote it down. At 7:30 p.m., there was a knock. It was louder than before, deliberate but not aggressive. Karen looked through the peephole and saw the same light jacket. No grocery bag this time. She did not answer. At 7:33 p.m., the man knocked again, then left. The elevator sound followed. Karen noted the change. Louder knock. No cover story, no device activation. On Thursday, May 6, David received a second call, this time from the cable company's security office. They asked to retrieve the removed amplifier for inspection. David agreed. At 2:15 p.m., a courier picked it up and issued a receipt with a tracking number. David placed the receipt in the manila folder. On Friday, May 7, the cable company called again. They said the amplifier was not consumer grade. It was designed for remote audio capture and timed activation. It was not sold to residential customers. The representative did not identify a manufacturer over the phone. He said the finding would be forwarded to corporate security. That was the moment when the case crossed the internal threshold. On Monday, May 10, two men arrived at the apartment at 11:20 a.m. They identified themselves verbally as federal agents and showed credentials through the chain lock. David did not invite them in until he confirmed their names by calling the number on the card provided. Inside, the agents asked for the folder. David handed over the notes, the photographs, the service reports, and the courier receipt. One agent logged each item on a yellow evidence sheet. The other asked Karen to repeat her observations from the beginning, slowly, without interpretation. He wrote down times, not impressions. At 12:05 p.m., the agents requested access to the VCR. They photographed the rear panel, the timer display, and the cabinet. They did not remove the machine. They asked David to leave it unplugged. Before leaving at 12:40 p.m., one agent placed a small piece of evidence tape over the cabinet door and initialed it. He wrote a case reference number on the tape. He did not explain it. That evening, there was no buzzer, no knock, no elevator pause. By the end of that week, the escalation was no longer theoretical. A non-residential listening device had been physically recovered, documented, and linked to timed external contacts. The evidence had moved from private notes to logged custody. The system that had been operating quietly inside the apartment had been interrupted, observed by outsiders, and confirmed as intentional. What remained unknown was who had installed it and what had been recorded. But the ambiguity that existed in the first weeks was gone. The mechanism had been exposed, and the response had shifted from service correction to federal review. Identification did not begin with suspects. It began with recordings. On Wednesday, the 12th of May, 1982, the VCR was collected. A technician returned with a federal evidence technician at 9:30 a.m. They photographed the cabinet seal, broke it, and removed the machine. A property receipt was issued listing the make, model, and serial number. David signed the receipt and kept the carbon copy in the folder that was now thinner. The machine was taken to a regional forensic lab. The agents did not describe the location. They logged the intake time and assigned the VCR an evidence tag. The VHS cassette that Karen had removed weeks earlier was still missing. That absence was noted, not explained. On May 14, the lab reported its first finding. The VCR's timer had been modified internally. A secondary circuit allowed it to activate recording without a cassette present, routing audio input directly through the added coaxial line. The modification was clean and reversible. It did not damage the original components. That mattered because it suggested professional installation rather than improvisation. The audio path led to the amplifier recovered from the basement. When powered separately, the amplifier activated on the same two daily windows that Karen had recorded. Just after 10 a.m. and between 7 and 8 p.m. The timing was controlled by an internal clock, not a remote signal. That meant whoever accessed the system expected to be physically present during those windows. On Monday, May 17, agents canvassed the building. They did not identify themselves as federal. They asked routine questions about maintenance, deliveries, and visitors during April. Most tenants reported nothing unusual. Two mentioned men waiting near the elevator on weeknights, but could not give dates. The building superintendent confirmed that no cable work orders had been authorized for David's unit before May. The first name entered the file on May 19. A vehicle registered to a shell leasing company had been ticketed twice on the block in April, both times during the evening window. Parking enforcement records listed the same driver's description both times, taken by different officers. Light jacket, short hair, grocery bag visible on the passenger seat. The vehicle had not been flagged as suspicious at the time. The leasing company address traced to a mailbox service near Los Angeles International Airport. The mailbox had been rented under a passport name that matched no entry records. That discrepancy moved the case from technical review to counterintelligence handling. By May 21, surveillance began. Not on the apartment, but on the routine that had replaced it. Agents monitored the parking area during the original time windows. On the third night, At 7:18 p.m., the same vehicle appeared and circled the block once without stopping. It left after 6 minutes. No approach was made to the building. On May 24, a second routine emerged. The mailbox near the airport was accessed at 10:30 a.m. by a man matching the earlier description. He retrieved nothing and left an empty envelope. That action was logged and photographed. The envelope was collected later by the mailbox service and stored. The envelope was plain, unmarked, and unsealed. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with no writing. When examined under magnification, it showed pressure marks consistent with note-taking on a pad above it. The marks were not readable, but they were oriented in blocks, not lines. That format matched known tradecraft for transcribing spoken material. By the end of May, the system logic was clear. The apartment had been used as a passive listening post. The timed visits aligned with expected access windows. The mailbox functioned as a dead drop, not for documents, but for confirmation signals. The grocery bag had never been for groceries. It had been a consistent, low-risk container for portable equipment. On June 2, agents identified the installer. A contractor badge recovered from a separate investigation matched the drilling method used behind the VCR. The badge number belonged to a man who had worked briefly for a subcontractor providing wiring services to residential buildings. He had left the company in 1981. His employment records listed a temporary address that matched the same mailbox service near the airport. On June 4, agents interviewed him at a rented apartment in Inglewood. He denied installing the device. He admitted to wiring work in West Los Angeles during the period but said he could not recall specific units. The interview lasted 40 minutes and ended without detention. The agents logged it as inconclusive. The identification phase did not produce a public suspect. It produced a network, a modified consumer device, a timed amplifier, a routine of physical presence, and a collection method designed to leave almost nothing behind. It explained how the system operated and why it had depended on invisibility rather than force. What it did not yet explain was who the recordings were for, or how much had already been captured before the interruption. The consequences unfolded quietly, through paperwork rather than arrests. On the 7th of June, 1982, a federal memorandum was issued assigning the case to a counterintelligence unit based in Los Angeles. The memo listed the recovered amplifier, the modified VCR, the photographs, and the service records as primary evidence. It did not name a suspect. It authorized limited surveillance and coordination with other agencies. That same day, the mailbox service near Los Angeles International Airport was formally contacted. At 2:40 p.m., an agent served a records request for rental logs, payment methods, and access times. The service complied and produced copies of sign-in sheets covering the previous 6 months. The records showed consistent access twice a day during the same windows observed at the apartment. No identification had been verified at the time of rental. On June 9, the empty envelope recovered from the mailbox was logged into evidence. A lab report dated June 11 concluded that the pressure marks were consistent with handwritten shorthand, likely transcribed from audio. No language could be identified. The report noted that the method prioritized deniability over durability. On June 14, the building superintendent received a formal notice. It required inspection of all cable conduits in the basement and common areas. The notice did not explain the reason. Over the next 3 days, maintenance staff identified 2 additional unauthorized splitters feeding inactive lines. Both were photographed, disconnected, and logged. Neither was connected to an active device. Those findings triggered a broader response. On June 18, the cable company issued an internal alert to its field technicians in the region. It included photographs of the recovered amplifier and instructions to report similar equipment immediately. The alert was not shared publicly. It was circulated as a routine security advisory. No arrests followed that month. Instead, the case moved into coordination. On June 23, a classified briefing summary was prepared for distribution to federal offices in other cities. It outlined the method used in Los Angeles. Consumer electronics modified for timed audio capture, physical access tied to predictable civilian routines, and confirmation through mundane public services rather than transmission. By July 1, the apartment itself was no longer central. David Hanley and his family were advised to replace the VCR and reroute their cable line under supervision. The work was completed on July 3. A completion form was signed and filed. The evidence tape was removed from the cabinet and destroyed. Karen Miller was interviewed one final time on July 6. The interview lasted 20 minutes. She was asked to confirm dates, times, and descriptions she had already provided. She was not asked to speculate. At the end, she signed a statement that her observations had been recorded accurately. She was not contacted again. On July 12, the leasing mailbox was closed. The service terminated the rental for non-compliance with updated identification requirements. The contents of the box at closure consisted of 2 empty envelopes and a receipt for 6 months of prepaid access. All were logged and stored. The formal consequence of the case was administrative, not dramatic. A listening operation had been disrupted. Its equipment had been seized. Its routines had been identified and rendered unusable. No public charges were announced because no operator had been caught in possession of the recordings. Internally, the case was treated as a confirmed foreign intelligence collection effort using civilian infrastructure. The absence of arrests did not negate the outcome. The operation had lost access, lost anonymity, and lost its primary collection point. By mid-July, active surveillance was reduced. The case file grew thicker, but quieter. The immediate threat had passed, not because it was confronted directly, but because the system it depended on no longer functioned. The aftermath settled into records, not headlines. On the 2nd of August 1982, the case file was formally closed for active investigation. A closure memo noted that the collection method had been neutralized and that no further activity matching the pattern had been detected for 30 consecutive days. The memo included a checklist of resolved items and was signed by a supervisory analyst. It did not recommend prosecution. The apartment building returned to routine maintenance. In early August, the basement panels were unlocked, inspected, and resealed without numbered tags. The superintendent kept a copy of the inspection report in a general facilities binder. No tenants were notified of the reason for the inspection. The added conduits were removed during unrelated electrical work later that year. David Hanley replaced the VCR with a newer model in September. The old cabinet was moved to storage, then discarded during a scheduled bulk pickup. No markings were visible by that point. The cable line feeding the apartment was rerouted through a different junction, logged by the provider as a standard upgrade. Service continued without interruption. Karen Miller returned to college that fall. She worked occasional babysitting jobs in other neighborhoods. She did not keep copies of her notes after the final interview. When asked later by friends why she stopped working at the West Los Angeles apartment, she said only that the schedule had changed. Internally, the case remained accessible. In October 1982, a reference to the Los Angeles listening setup appeared in a broader analytical summary circulated within counterintelligence units. It was listed as an example of low-cost, low-visibility collection using consumer technology. The summary emphasized routine access, predictable civilian behavior, and delayed detection. It did not name the apartment or the individuals involved. The modified amplifier was retained in storage for several years. Its evidence tag was updated twice as custody transferred between facilities. In 1987, it was photographed again for comparison with equipment recovered in an unrelated case. The design similarities were noted. No direct link was established. The mailbox service near the airport changed ownership in the mid-1980 seconds. Rental policies tightened. Identification was required at sign-up. The specific box number used in the case was reassigned and later removed when the wall was renovated. No record of the earlier rental was kept on site beyond the retention period. By the end of the decade, the case was rarely referenced. It had not produced arrests, indictments, or public acknowledgement. Its value lay elsewhere. It demonstrated how a listening operation could exist inside an ordinary apartment, rely on nothing more than routine access and modified household equipment, and remain unnoticed until someone wrote down the times. The final entry in the file was a short administrative note dated the 14th of December 1989. It stated that the case materials had been reviewed and reclassified for long-term storage. The note listed the contents by number: photographs, service reports, device schematics, and interview summaries. It did not include the missing VHS cassette. That item remained unaccounted for. After that, there were no more updates. The building continued to fill and empty with tenants. The elevator stopped on the same floors. The hallway buzzer rang for deliveries and visitors with legitimate reasons. The routine that had once supported something else blended back into ordinary use. The case ended not with resolution, but with disappearance. The system failed because it depended on repeating the same small actions in the same place. Once those actions were noticed, logged, and interrupted, there was nothing left to observe.